Para começar esse episódio, então, eu preciso te dar um recado importantíssimo. Maio é o mês da remuneração, você já sabe, e a gente está comemorando 30 anos. E a gente não pode comemorar sem oferecer para vocês um monte de presente. Tá aqui nesse evento, cobrindo esse evento nos Estados Unidos, é um deles, um baita presentaço para vocês, pra gente também é um privilégio. E a gente tá oferecendo também para os novos contratos da Consulta Salarial, que é a maior plataforma de remuneração do Brasil, 10% de desconto. Então, se você quiser conhecer a Consulta, você precisa clicar no link, tá? Que tá aqui embaixo, para garantir esse desconto. Também preciso te dizer que a gente vai viver uma imersão do Quinto Dia Útil. É isso aí. Eu tô falando do Open House do Quinto Dia Útil. Vai rolar dia 19 de junho, lá em Dayatuba, um evento presencial imersivo. Quer conhecer como é que é os bastidores do podcast, como que a gente grava os episódios? Quer ter a oportunidade de fazer perguntas diretamente para os entrevistados? Conhecer o pessoal da carreira? Se conectar com mais de 300 profissionais de remuneração? Essa é a oportunidade para você. Clica no link então, garante seu ingresso e a gente se vê lá. A conversa com a Margret, eu não vou me arriscar a falar o sobrenome dela, mas você vai ver no GC, foi muito legal. Ela é uma pessoa de fora de remuneração com uma perspectiva acadêmica para falar sobre o assunto. Foi muito interessante entrevistá-la. Além disso, ela está há mais de 10 anos estudando sobre o tema, falando sobre o assunto, e ela é cofundadora de uma empresa que chama Pay Analytics. Então, apesar dela não ser uma profissional de remuneração, ela está imersa nesse universo e tem também muito embasamento para falar sobre as questões de remuneração e principalmente de transparência e de pay gap. Ela contou pra gente também um pouquinho sobre como a Europa tá olhando pra essa questão e como ela tem endereçado esse assunto aqui pros Estados Unidos, e eu tenho certeza que vai ser super aplicável pro nosso contexto também no Brasil. Ela fez uma provocação muito importante, que tá inclusive na thumb desse vídeo. Se você clicou por causa disso, fica aqui que o papo foi muito bom. Ela falou que os salários, os aumentos, as promoções, eles no fundo, em essência, não são feitos por performance. Sentiu a provocação, né? Pois é. Então fica aí pra conferir por que ela falou isso. Bora lá?
Thank you so much. Professor Margret,
yes.
Welcome to the Quinto Dia Útil podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you because we have a huge content. We were talking yesterday like, oh my God, we would like to have this conversation with Margret. So we are here right now.
You're finally, yes. We made it happen.
Yeah. Margret, this subject, I think you are searching, studying, and you are doing 2 sessions here in the US.
Yes.
It's so important because we are talking about this in Brazil. We have a new law that do the same with the Europe, that we need to put our reports in the internet to show like companies with more than 100 employees.
Okay.
So how do you see this movement in the world to change the way we work, pay, and reduce the pay gaps we have?
Yeah, so that's a very broad question. So we can probably talk about that for a long time. So I think in all of our pay equity conversations, it's important to acknowledge that typically we talk about 2 types of gaps. And the one that you're referring to is what in the US we call the gender pay gap, or the racial pay gap, and then we are just comparing averages. I think another and equally important conversation are our equal pay gaps, right? So after we control for the many different factors, are we then still seeing bias? So let me maybe tackle both of them a little bit. So the regulation and the European Pay Transparency Directive is mostly focused on the former, right? So these absolute gaps and how can we start chipping away at them. And I think in terms of transparency, yes, publicly posting these average pay gaps, they help, but in my opinion, only on the margin, right? So we have seen these laws, so this law and this requirement of actually having your gender pay gap on a website has been for many years in the UK, and it hasn't really moved the needle that much. Because what are you really posting? You're posting just the difference in average pay between men and women. And in many organizations, we have men at the top, or the men on pilots, and the women are serving in the back of the plane, or etc. So these can always be justified or explained, right? And then it doesn't push anything forward. So it's, in my opinion, it's when there are other parts of the European Pay Transparency Directive that will help more in pushing us towards reducing pay inequity. So that's, for example, the right of the employee to learn about the salaries of their coworkers.
Yes.
So
Okay.
in a similar, learn about the pay of basically men and women that are similarly situated. That will help. Forcing organizations to measure the pay gaps amongst group of workers, and that's where the biggest kind of uncertainty around the directive is how will the similar workers or the job categories be defined. So that's the biggest regulatory uncertainty right now with the directive. But the directive will force you to measure your pay gaps within those groups. That will help. So any time that when we start talking about pay of workers that are similarly situated and forcing organizations to measure it, that's when we start changing the conversation, right? Because then we are not talking about the hypothetical, all the men are pilots, right? And that explains everything. No, we're talking about here's a group of employees that all have similar responsibilities, and this is the pay gap. And now what are you going to do about it?
And not only the same job, but within the same job architecture, if they are in the same level, like L4, for instance, then they would be able to request that information?
Yeah, so that depends on how the implementation will be, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so the letter of the directive talks about categories of workers.
Okay.
And nobody has defined what a category of worker is,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
And now the European directive is with the member states, and everybody will have to come up with what's a category of worker. And then that's, for me, or in my mind, that's the biggest question mark, right? Is that going to be defined very narrowly? So it will be me and everybody who has the same job title or a very similar job title and does very similar work, or will it be broader? And we have examples of both. So, for example, the current French legislation has a very broad categories of workers. There are 5.
Wow.
I don't remember them on top of my head, but it's like, your blue-collar workers, your specialists, your manager. I mean, there's not. And so there are huge groups. So where the directive and category of worker will land, that's the big question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like we do this part of the job, like job architectures, these structure to pay, job descriptions. We have many layers in Brazil too. When we, especially with our consulting firm, we work with the blue collars, and we have many layers to do this and to protect the company, not to protect but to explain to the government like these differences we get at the pay range we have. So because we have a man and a woman and we have different positions. If the company has a salary plan, we can show and understand what is happening, because I can pay for more for a man than a woman, but and the opposite could be possible. But when we have a plan, we can show to the market and we can show to the government that we have a strategy. And then both will be together at the same time in a moment that we understand that is good. Maybe 1 year, 2 years, depending on the job position. So you think that
In a pay range.
like this is the point. Every company needs to have a plan like this to understand and to correct this.
So the question, what's the question to me?
Yeah,
It's like if the company has the job architecture
Right.
and all the jobs were leveled, and
Yes.
is it safer? Is the company like, okay, I'm fine, I'm doing the right thing?
If a pay
bigger
gap
than
is
that.
spotted, but I have this plan, this structure, and I can justify that I have these differences, these pay differences, because they are in the same in different moments of their pay range. For example, can I justify this pay gap for a moment? Can I be more sure that it's something I can rely on?
So you can have an amazing job architecture and still have equal pay gaps,
Okay.
right? So so how do these equal pay gap. So now we're switching to kind of, are we discriminating as opposed to what's the absolute gap? So you can have an amazing job architecture and you can still have equal pay gaps if you're placing workers into their pay ranges, but you tend to say, oh, you're such a good friend and you're so amazing. Yeah. I'll put you a little bit above average, right? Mm-hmm. But you just joined me. Let's, you have, place to grow. That put you below average, right? So if these biases affect our decision making, even within our amazing structure, we can have equal pay gaps. And that was actually one of the talks that I gave here, was focusing on this, like what are the root causes of these equal pay gaps? And one of the kind of my core message was, because in the US, now I don't know Brazil, I just have to apologize for that, but in the US, organizations have been checking their pay equity for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, maybe a decade, the ones who started really early, and they have been measuring their equal pay gaps, and then they have found equal pay gaps, but the remediation has always focused on what I call the negative outliers. Those who fall the furthest below where we expect them to be, or those who are at the bottom of the pay range, right? And the correction has always been there. And my argument was that doesn't necessarily close your equal pay gaps. And when I look at empirically data from organizations that have been working on their pay equity issues is not for the people at the bottom, because they have been looking at them for years. They have made their justifications. So what I see over and over again is that women are more likely to get stuck at or below average, while men tend to be more likely to be above average, and the difference can be like 10-15%. So the example that I gave from a real organization was that the probability of a man being below expected pay was 45%. The probability of women being below expected pay was 60%.
Okay.
That's where the decision bias is, the repeated decisions that we make over and over again.
Marriage cycles and...
Exactly, that's how they manifest.
And usually when you see the job architecture, they say, we can't explain. It's like education and productivity and so on. But then if you cross and you do a correlation between, men and women, and in Brazil, women have a higher education than men. And if you see just the assessments year to year, there is no difference in productivity. And so it's explainable, but not really.
No, but then if you have all of that information, right, we throw it into a pay equity model. And now I don't know how much your audience knows about pay equity models, but it's what's called a regression model. Yeah. And you account for everything that you said, right? We can account for education if that's part of your pay philosophy. We can, if you're paying for performance, I would hope you have some kind of performance metrics, right? Yeah. So then we can account for that. So when I talk about equal pay gaps, I've taken all of that into account. So what is left and what these equal pay gaps represent is the average impact on women, how much lower they get paid after accounting for everything else. And that's what we need to fix.
Yeah.
And I don't think, going kind of back full circle to your first question, I don't think posting the overall gender pay gap on a website is going to push us there. We need other tools to push that.
Yeah, because as long as they can say, I have a job architecture, I don't define salaries by, person. It's always jobs and levels, so we're fine. And not really.
No, you're not. You have an amazing system, so now use the system to, eliminate pay inequity, right? Because now you have the tools. You can use your job architecture to conduct these pay equity studies, right? You can monitor how you make salary offers for incoming employees, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And now there are even decision tools that allow you to do that, right? So anytime somebody comes in, you get a suggestion of a fair pay for the person, and you have to justify if you move that up or down. And just the fact that you have to justify your decisions makes them more neutral. Because I can no longer say, but you're such a good friend, right? It has to be objective reasons. Even that helps eliminate that bias.
I see.
Yeah, we're talking about AI to help with it. We have a good case in Brazil that was here last year with a company that iFood Benefícios.
I
iFood.
actually spoke to that on my podcast.
Oh yeah.
That was actually one of the best sessions last year.
Oh yeah.
Yes, so I have my own podcast where it's very short and sweet. I talk about pay equity. So, and that I took that as an example of one of the best talks last year.
What's the name of your podcast so we can recommend to the Brazilian
I don't know if you want to recommend it, but it's called Coffee Talk from Planet Fair.
Okay,
Wow,
Coffee
good.
Talk.
Yeah.
We'll put it on the description in this video. And if you are
awesome.
listening on Spotify, go to YouTube to see her podcast.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
And another thing, wow, iFood. I think Lilian is here with us. Like, you'll be very
Happy to
wow.
hear
The
that, yeah.
professor told about my
Lilia
presentation. Nice.
Yeah.
Another point is transparency. In Brazil, is beginning this process, and we are focused on equity, like to understand the report, to show the reports. But I think transparency is the next two. Like, if you see everything, you can understand a little bit better, and I can discuss about my salary and understand that why am I here and you are not. Are you friend of him? Like, what's happening? So you think transparency could be better in this process to change all this stuff?
I'll add to that question, like, not only to comply, like the minimum that the government asks us to comply, but if the company wants to be more transparent, like to show the employees, like, imagine the first day they come, have the training and say, oh, this is our structure.
No.
So you start here, you can go here, here, here. Those are the salaries for the next positions and so on. Would that be a good way to...
Or to know everyone's salary, like to open everything. Like we having this in our consulting firm.
Okay.
Everyone knows like the salaries and broadbands.
Okay. So, yeah. So I think pay transparency is such a wide concept. And there's so much under the transparency umbrella. So then when we have conversations about pay transparency, we have to start to get very specific, right? So we've been talking about this external transparency, which is this posting of gender pay gaps, which I don't think works really well. But then there's the internal transparency, and there's also the transparency that comes from requiring pay ranges to be posted in job listings, right? So if you've been around this conference, everybody is trying to get their job architecture in decent shape so that they can go transparent, and it's all a part of that bigger picture. So I think, yes, that helps more than posting a gender pay gap. So even if I'm hiring and I post a salary band, hopefully all internal employees observe that and can learn from that about their own position. I think the being able to request, like is part of the European Directive, being able to request information about salaries of similarly situated employees is huge. And what is there's a small nugget in the directive that is very clever, because it says that companies have to inform their employees about this right annually. So it's not just like, you can comply by being quiet. No, you have to tell employees you have the right to this information. So, trying to kind of then spur some conversation. So I don't know who put that nugget into the directive, but I will take my hat off to that person, because I think that's very important. Yeah.
And just one question, where can we find this European directive? It's online?
It's online.
We can just Google it, and then it's not for so like for the academic world. So human beings can find it easily.
Yes, but interestingly, if you Google it, it's not the first 5 links.
Okay.
So you have to dig around a little bit. So because everybody's writing about the European directive, so you will get all the consultancies and the pay equity firms, and so you have to kind of, and Yes, you can Google it. Just be patient. You will eventually find
And go to ChatGPT and ask for ChatGPT. Like, where's the best link to go to the right point?
Is that reliable?
but I can also provide you with a link. If you want a link that, just, I can give you the link. Absolutely.
Okay.
So we can add to our description, this
Exactly.
video description.
Yeah.
Like, how long have you been studying this?
So, studying this. So
Just
in
because
pay
it's
equity.
yeah.
So it actually started a decade ago, almost.
Wow.
Yeah. So do you want the story?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
please.
So so it so happened that a COO that was responsible for the HR function in a financial institution, and they measured an 8% equal pay gap. So not the absolute gender pay gap that you post, but literally, on average, women could expect to be paid 8% less than a similar man. Absolutely not acceptable, right? So, the CEO of the firm stood at the podium, said, this is not acceptable, we are going to do something about this. So then everybody in the management was very mindful about this gap in all their hiring, ad hoc adjustments, promotions over a 12-month period. They measured again, and what was the pay gap? Exactly the same, right? Nothing had happened. So that was really an aha moment when they realized that good intentions, wanting to do the right thing, does not close equal pay gaps. So then he was talking about this to me, and so my PhD is in what's called operation research. Nobody knows what operation research is, but it's literally mathematical modeling using data to improve decision making. I was like, oh my God, this is like the perfect research opportunity, because what do we want to do? We want to close the pay gap. We have all the data of the employees, so now I just need the right mathematical model to do so. So that's how they started. So I actually started developing algorithms to close equal pay gaps.
Wow.
And then people heard about it and wanted to learn more. And so we built a beta in Excel. So I don't know if any of you have ever done any software, but that's a terrible idea. It's so fragile. To code in Excel is terrible. So it was, the most fragile piece of software. But people were willing to pay for it. So we would, drive around town with our Excel admin on our UPS sticks and plug it in.
Wow.
So, and then we realized that we really had something, and then we built, a company from that called Pay Analytics that does nothing but helping organizations actually close the gaps. So, and then that has kind of supported this more academic research on, for example, the Transparência Directive. We have a couple of papers on how to close gaps, and that's what I was talking about and preaching about yesterday. And then we have a couple of other research projects going on. So one of the papers that is forthcoming is that we are focusing on the impact of gender quotas on boards. So what happens? And not just on the gender quota on boards, but what happens to internal policies with organizations. And we're working on that with an organization called Equileap, which collects all of that data. And then the most fun thing that we're doing right now is that we have 180 million LinkedIn job postings.
Wow.
Yeah, but they're in ugly format. So there's some serious data crunching going on to try to extract information from that, and we're going to use that to kind of study the labor market in the US and have some fun with it. So yeah, so this just, I'm an accidental entered this field, but it has been very rewarding.
Are you happy to see like the change within this last 10 years?
Yes. So we have made a lot of progress. I think when I started, like that organization, well-meaning as it was, had an 8% equal pay gap. It very fast, like the conversations, very fast changed until, you had to be under 5%, you had to be under 2%. And then now if you look at what's happening in the US, organizations that are going public with their efforts, they are always quoting 99 cents on the dollar. So when do companies now feel comfortable talking about this? Is when they're very close to closing, right? So then I had my workshop here yesterday, and I was talking about, okay, we have to address the root causes when we close these pay gaps, and how do we do that, and how should we think about it? And then one of the participants said, yeah, you probably have to wait 20 years. And I was like, oh my God, you're going to make me cry. I don't want to wait another 20 years. I feel like we should have this
right
taken
now.
care of right now.
Yeah.
But I will will continue to preach about it.
Something I see like happening quite a lot is even companies that are quite comfortable with their equal pay job to job sometimes have differences because the higher jobs are always there are always more men doing these jobs. How do we address that as well?
Yeah, and I mean, I think kind of related to your previous question, that's where this is going. So we started very much focused on pay equity, making sure that we weren't discriminatory in our pay decisions. And now once organizations kind of have that under control, they are moving towards addressing more what I label as workplace equity. So how do we start addressing this broader gender issues? And it's a more complicated and a nuanced question, right? Because it doesn't have, I can just find women, give them a salary raise and close the equal pay gap. That's not how we close the gender pay gap. So it's about a lot of things, right? It's about being very mindful in our hiring. It's being very mindful in our promotions. It's about creating an environment within an organization that is welcoming to everybody. And I would say in the US, especially, that doesn't stop with gender, right? So thinking about race, thinking about sexual orientation. So how do we create an equitable workplace where everybody feels welcome and has a room to grow? So, and then one of my favorite metrics, because I'm a data nerd, is looking at attrition, because that tells you a lot about have you managed to create that workplace where people want to come and work for you and grow and stay? So looking at who is leaving is often the biggest kind of piece of information that you can learn from. Yeah. So in pay equity, so the one piece of information I love in pay equity is when organizations are performance driven and we have their performance data, and so often it's an aha moment when we show them that pay is not really driven by performance at all. So that's always just a wonderful conversation, because then we can get into conversation about, okay, how do you actually make your decisions? How do we make that more equitable? And on the other side, when we think about the gender pay gap and creating these equitable workplaces, it's looking at the attrition data that's really telling. Who is leaving, meaning who doesn't have the chance to grow within your organization, who doesn't feel welcome, or there might be restrictions that cause people to leave and they're unable to stay, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the other piece of data that I love talking about, yeah.
The book, Capital in the 21st Century from Thomas Piketty, have you read this?
I haven't read it.
Yeah.
I have not read it. No.
Oh, yeah. Because part of this conversation, he's talking about this income distribution, and I think he opened a door. Like, I'm not a guy from economics, and I don't understand very much this subject, but he opened the door, like, to discuss in the world, to open about these, and this is part of this huge conversation that we have problems, especially in an underdeveloped country like Brazil. Yeah. We are suffering with problems that surround this subject we are talking here. So I think it's important when we have people open this conversation without jargons and hard words to understand. Like you were doing, you have your podcast, the way you talk, and I didn't understand why you wouldn't like to share this, because what is the way you talk about this subject in your podcast? Is something easy or something strong, like to talk with others?
No, it's an interesting comment. And I think, and we were talking about biases, right? Mm-hmm. So when I started teaching, I was very young, just with my PhD. And then, one of the biases that are well documented is the bias against women professors, young professors, and professors that speak with a foreign language. So I was a young woman speaking with a very strong foreign accent. So I think because I'm expressing myself in my second language, mm-hmm. I don't have, for example, I'm way funnier in Icelandic.
We are in Brazil as well.
Yeah, exactly, because we are talking in a second language, and my brain is very mathematically oriented. I'm not a language person. So I think by default my language is more simple, and I use simpler terms because that's where I feel comfortable. So maybe that's why. If I were talking about this in Icelandic, well, I've been in the States for a very long time, so I don't know if I'd be any better in Icelandic, but I speak differently in Icelandic, and I can use the language in more nuanced manner that I can't do in English because it's my second language. So, so on my podcast, so it's, we are two hosts, me and Henrike von Platten. She's an equal pay advocate from Germany. She founded the Fair Pay Innovation Lab. And we are just trying to get information out. So we interview people, we talk about best strategies, and it's all very accessible. Because she's also speaking in her second language, right? Yeah. So it's all very plain language, and we try to be very practical. Because I think when I put on my academic hat, yes, I have to develop some theories about why we're seeing something within organizations. But if we want to actually impact and push change, you have to make it practical and actionable.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we need to change our decision making. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Are you happy in doing what you do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like.
I can see your eyes. It's like shine.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not what was my plan. I didn't plan to be like at a conference talking about pay equity and pushing pay equity, and it wasn't part of some kind of master plan, to be honest, because I found an amazing unaddressed problem. But I have always been driven by using analytics and now AI for social good. So how can we use mathematics and data and to make better decisions to improve the world around us? And that pay equity happens to be in that sweet spot, so I have stayed for a decade now. So yeah.
Have you ever been in Brazil?
I have been to Brazil.
Yeah.
Yes, but a long time ago, in '96.
96.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
The Olympics in Atlanta, 96, I think, and you were in Brazil. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Would like to come back to do this podcast with 2 hours with us in Brazil.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Invite me over, and I can buy the ticket, and I can. Yeah, I was very young, but amazing countries. That's where I learned just to sit down and wait.
That haven't changed.
I remember we were scheduled for some boat trip, and then it was just wait. And we sat there for an hour and something waiting. So I learned, that's what I learned in Brazil.
Professor Margret, thank you so much to be here with us.
Of course, my pleasure.
This is a kind of conversation that we need to do more and more, and because I think this is the way to change the world, and all the practices we have that most of them are wrong, unfortunately, but we are in the way to correct all of them.
We are on the way. And let's try to accelerate.
Have you listened to the main stage presentation yesterday with the HROs from HubSpot in Patagonia?
No.
They said, the HRO from Patagonia said, we need to bless and release. So we bless the things that has happened in the past. So, and now we let it go and then think about better things, new things, but have to bless it and think, oh, that brought me here and now I have to do something else, something better with that. So bless and release, I think that's the the thing we can think about when we study about pay gap and things. So I recognize we lived this way and now we have to do better. So
couldn't agree more.
Thank you. E se você gostou desse podcast, senta o dedo no like, porque toda vez que você curte, você espalha esse conteúdo para outras pessoas que têm interesse como o teu. E não se esquece de se inscrever no nosso canal, não, porque isso é importante. Você vai receber tudo que a gente coloca de conteúdo. Beleza?
Thank you. We promise. He didn't say...
Do 2 things. Like and subscribe.
Yes.
Just
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.